Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced by North Idaho College located on Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guests.
With today's program, we're starting a 10-week series, as we do each year, on the symposium at North Idaho College under the auspice of what we call the North Idaho College Popcorn Forum and Convocation Series. This series at the college and on this program is titled this year, In Search of the Human Spirit. It is a journey that all human beings take and have historically. And we've chosen certain aspects of the human spirit to cover in this process. We have invited to our campus scholars from around the country to play famous people in history, and we're delighted to welcome back to kick off this year's series In Search of the Human Spirit, in character, President Thomas Jefferson, the third President of the United States, who lived from 1743 until 1826 and was elected President in 1800 and 1804. We've invited the distinguished third President of the United States to our program today to talk about one of the areas of human spirit that is on this symposium, and that is the issue of love. And our guest is going to talk about his concept of love. And Mr. President, welcome back. We've had you on the last 5 years here at our institution and on our program, and it's a pleasure having you here.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And I'm very pleased to welcome our regular panelists to join in this Chautauqua discussion of famous people in history being portrayed by scholars today, and that is Janelle Burke, an attorney in the state of Idaho. And Janelle will commence today's question with President Thomas Jefferson.
President Jefferson, it's so nice to have you here again and be able to talk with you about some of the things that you did in your lifetime, but specifically about your feelings with regard to the head and to the heart. And you indicated what some of those feelings were in letters that you sent. Can you explain what those letters were and to whom you sent them?
Well, let me say, first of all, they were very private letters. I'm not fond of talking about love. I think love is a private business, and I'm not a romantic in any sense of the term. In fact, the less said about these things, the better. But I did write 22,000 letters, and a number of them are extant, including a famous letter called My Head and My Heart, and so the documentary record stands. But I will say this much by way of beginning the discussion. The head is more reliable than the heart. The head teaches us what longitude and latitude are. The head designs coinage. The head makes agriculture a scientific enterprise rather than an intuitive one. The head calculates an eclipse. The head creates good government. So the head is our best instrument, and the Enlightenment, which I was an exemplar of, was profoundly given over to the business of the head. There is a heart too, of course, and I acknowledge it, but I think it's subordinate.
Okay, and your letter, The Head and the Heart, was addressed to whom?
Well, I was in Europe. My wife had been dead for several years. She died at the age of 33 in September of 1782. I went to Europe as the American minister to the court of Louis XVI. After I'd been there about a year, I met an extraordinary Italian Anglo painter and musician named Maria Cosway. And Mrs. Cosway was, I suppose, the last great love of my life.
How old were you at that time?
I was in my early 40s.
So you'd had time then to kind of think about this head and heart business.
Well, as a boy, I had fallen in love with Rebecca Burwell, a Virginia girl, and I had behaved like a ninny. And I had been head over heels in love and awkward, and had proposed to her in a very diffident and foolish way. And I was devastated when she married somebody else. So I knew what it was to be foolish in love. And then I had married my wife Martha in 1772, and that was a marriage of good sense. There was passion in it, of course. She was pregnant 6 times in 10 years, and she gave birth to 6 children. But it was a marriage of esteem more than it was a marriage of grand romance. So I was unprepared when I got to France to be swept off my feet by a woman. I thought I was beyond all of that. I was an old man at 40, and I was an ambassador, and I took myself very seriously as a scientist, and I had, moreover, vowed on my wife's deathbed never to remarry and implicitly never to love again.
Mr. President, we had the pleasure this morning of hearing a great address by you concerning this, what I guess I would call at times a struggle between who wins out on a particular decision, the heart or the head. I would appreciate if you would, with our audience, talk in some more detail, particularly your letter, the head and the heart. There is a dialogue that's going on between the two forces, and one reason why I want you to do this, even though we live in a very different time than yours, a long time since your letter was written, and I feel, though, that today we have the same struggles that you were having. I know that you do not like to talk about this very much. You think that it's mundane compared with what you really want to deal with. But we've had the privilege on previous shows to talk about all the other things. Just share some of that dialogue of the head says this, the heart says this, and you've experienced both, and I know that you feel that sometimes you didn't heed the head as you thought you should have.
Well, let me say, first of all, I don't consider it mundane. I do consider it beneath the dignity of your viewers, that of all the things we might talk about, tax policy or the West or Native Americans or Lewis and Clark or architecture or paleontology or library classification, those are subjects worthy of the public's notice.
So this is of less significance to you?
Yes, my private life is of no value to anyone. What value where value exists is in the Declaration of Independence or the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty. But I take your point, and I certainly won't struggle with the nature of the discussion. I think it has broader implications beyond love or sexuality. The head says, the art of happiness is the art of avoiding pain. I think that's very important, that human relationships are inevitably painful. There's loss, death, divorce, loss of affection, alienation of affection, the endless struggles of life. And if we are complete human beings, we come to terms with those struggles in our own self. We master our passions. We find balance, a kind of Aristotelian golden mean. It's hard enough to do this in our own lives as individuals. But once you attach yourself to somebody else, now suddenly you have taken on their difficulties, their losses, their griefs, their unresolved questions of happiness. So it's hard enough for one person. It's almost impossible for more than one. That's one of the head's points. And the head says, quite pointedly, never snatch at the bait of pleasure till you know there is no hook beneath it. And I'm here to tell you that there is inevitably a hook beneath all pleasures, that pain follows as night follows day and day follows night. So the head's point of view is that the best recipe for happiness is the avoidance of unhappiness. And that means we ought to become fortresses unto ourselves, sufficient for our own delights. The heart clearly disagrees. The heart argues that the head is desiccated and calculated and dreary, and that if we only lived according to rationality, our lives would be a desert. That what redeems life is the spasmodic generosity of spirit which has no reason, which is inherently irrational. And in my famous letter, the heart says there would have been no American Revolution if we had been heady, because we wouldn't have ever calculated that we could have defeated Great Britain, and that we would never give help to the poor if we were heady, because we know that they will misuse it. It's the heart. Spontaneous generosity of spirit, sympathy, a sense of justice, a sense of joy, a sense of harmony that binds the world together, and that's really the redemptive value in life, even if it is sometimes painful. And even pain, says the heart, can be in a sense pleasurable if it's shared in a love relationship, if we succor each other in our griefs.
President Jefferson, even though you had advocated the use of the head, you, I suppose I could say, in the 80-some years that you lived, listened most often to the head, but certainly not all the time. Would you particularly share with us the case of Miss Causeway and an example where you wish you had used the head and an injury that you had? And
I wish I'd used the head throughout. Frankly, she was married, and we were 18th century lovers, so that means we showed much greater propriety than might be shown in your own time. And let me just say, you live in an extremely hearty time. I think it's vulgar in its heartiness, and I would urge everyone in your world to be more heady, to to be more rational, to be more controlled, to be more careful in their pursuits of pleasure and industry. But it is true that when you fall in love, you do spasmodic things, and one of the things that occurred in my relationship with Mrs. Cosway was that we were walking in a park in Paris, and we came to a stile, a little fence, and she challenged me the way a lover does to jump over it. And in my heartiness, in my infatuation, I would put it, I tried to jump over the fence and tripped. In doing so, I broke my right wrist, or it certainly dislocated it, and I went to the 18th century equivalency of a surgeon. They were barbers then. Medicine was in a state of almost unbelievable primitiveness, and he misset the wrist, and I never gained full use of it again. I lived for 40 years after that. Every time I used that wrist, tried to write a letter, for example, and felt the shooting pains up my arm, I was reminded of the folly of the heart, because the head would have immediately told me that it was idiotic to try to jump over a fence to gain a woman's affection. I mean, certainly that's not the price of a woman's affection.
Thank you. Janelle Berg.
Well, perhaps one or the other tugged at you at different times in your life, and as you grew older, you came to terms with both of them. Which one prevailed, or did they both?
I mean, my achievement is the achievement of the head. But the heart is always involved. The University of Virginia could have been a run-of-the-mill sort of organization, but the buildings are famous because they are Palladian, because they are neoclassical. Now that sounds heady, but the heart played a large role in it. I had set my heart on a certain type of architecture, a certain type of ambiance, a certain type of atmosphere for the University of Virginia. The Declaration of Independence is an appeal to the heart that we have rights. Our rights have been trampled upon by tyrants. We are now hurt and wounded and even angry, and so we're rising up because we mustn't allow ourselves to be treated in this way. So there's a great deal of heart in it. And I dare say that what makes the Declaration of Independence such a famous document is that it's heady in its argumentation, but hearty in its passion, and that it's a combination of those two things which give it its value. If it were merely a treatise, no one would read it. But if it were all heart, if it were just an outpouring of grief and remorse and anger, then no one would find it worthy of respect. So I think in the ideal life, these things are blended to a certain degree. But I will say this, when in doubt, gravitate towards the head, be wary of the heart. I think that's a fair reading of the griefs of life. I don't think it's a reading that comes from my own wounds. I don't think it's a reading that comes from a repressed view of life. I think it's an honest response that we should try to find balance, but we should move somewhat towards the head side of the spectrum.
Mr. President, in our time, people often admire those who are open, those who are very honest and very open. In your time, does that mean that you were more guarded? You were more careful in how you approached things, even when you were dealing with the heart?
Oh, of course. I mean, Mrs. Jefferson called me Mr. Jefferson. This was in situations that you would call intimate. It's doubtful that I ever saw her fully naked. We called each other by our formal names. I would have called my daughters Miss Jefferson at times. We were an extremely polite age. You need to think of a Jane Austen novel to make sense of my world. And when I was angry at George Washington or Alexander Hamilton or my daughter, I would never have said, "I'm angry." I would have said, "Your behavior today, I find, makes it impossible for us to pursue this in quite the way we might have intended." But everything was polite, everything was indirect. We prided ourselves on being civilized. And what is to be civilized but to rise above the animal passions, the base passions? Instead of lust, the beautiful diffusion of love. Instead of power relationships, friendship and alliance. And so these relationships, based upon what we took to be civility, were the core of our value system. And I could only look upon your world, the way people express themselves, the things they talk about to perfect strangers, as almost unbearably vulgar by 18th century standards. Now you might see us as too polite, over-civilized, maybe repressed and insufficiently candid, but we would have felt the same alienation from the style of your world.
Mr. President, in dealing with political essays and writings, I believe I am correct to say that when you use the term the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration, that it's the first time in a really formal document that has survived and has had great political influence around the world appeared in writing. Would you share with us, in relation to that concept, how that fits into the head and the heart, although you've already indicated that the Declaration itself had some great blending of these two parts of the human being. Where would you place your use of pursuit of happiness?
Well, first of all, let me say that the phrase actually comes from John Locke. Locke uses it in several occasions, and it's not original to me. What I meant in that document was the pursuit of public happiness, that if you're born in a tyranny, or a colony for that matter, and you don't find it adequate to your own sense of your national destiny, you have a sacred right to overthrow that government and make one of your own choice. So every society has a right to define its own happiness and to pursue it in its own way, just as the French did in the French Revolution. And that doesn't sound happy, a bloodbath in the streets, a reign of terror, beheadings, and so on. But the French people were pursuing happiness and throwing off the yoke of all the unhappiness that had been built up over centuries. So it's a public phrase in that document. But Locke, remember, in another context, had written that we have rights to life, liberty, and property. I think property can be overrated as a human good. It's a human good, but it can be overrated. And so I substituted life, liberty, and happiness for life, liberty, and property. And I meant this to be a dreamy statement. I think America is a land of dreams. It's a land of promise. It's a land where people are going to be liberated from the errors of the past. Bad churches, bad economic systems, bad social structures. And so that liberation of the American spirit will undoubtedly lead to happiness. And in that sense, I mean personal happiness. People will be less beaten down by the forces of life than they have been in other nations at other times, because of the continent that we live on, because of the equality that we share, and because of our superb constitutions.
I want to get another area, and it certainly has to do, I would suggest, with the human spirit and attitude and relationship between peoples and countries. And I know that you'll be willing to clarify for me. I'm somewhat confused. On the one hand, you had very critical comments to make about Europe, and you were very delighted there was a 3,000-mile barrier, the ocean between us, and yet at the same time you had tremendous praise for the civility and sophistication of the French. How do you take those two concepts and make those consistent?
I'm as puzzled as you are by this problem. I mean, how can the French produce French wine and live in a tyranny? How can the French produce the paintings of David or the statues of Houdon or the marvelous civility of their salon conversations and yet be the most miserable people, the worst governed people in the world? I don't understand this any more than you do. But I will say this. Here's the real question. What's the price of opera? Does opera require class hierarchies and hypertaxation and tyrannical governments and a system where a few people are as rich as angels and the masses are beaten down systematically by bad institutions? Is that the price of opera and dance? If it is, then we want folk art here. Because if opera can only come at the pinnacle of a hierarchical civilization which mistreats the mass of men, then we don't want high culture. And so the question to ask is the best poetry, is the best sculpture, is the best painting, is the best music the product of a class system that is fundamentally unjust, or could it be naturalized in a fair culture like ours? Maybe it wouldn't be quite so glittering in its achievement, but can it be naturalized in an equalitarian culture? I think that's the issue that the American people faced in my time, and frankly, it's the issue that you continue to face in your time. Can you be a civilization and have actual equality of circumstance and actual equality and justice? I think the question is still open in your time, but I am foursquare in favor of folk culture, modest artistic achievement, if that means justice. And if opera can only come at the end of an aristocracy, then we can live without it in this country. Perhaps we'll go to Europe from time to time and see their operas, and then come back to this, our happy republic, and watch folk dance in the streets.
As what would be officially today called ambassadorship. You were ambassador to France, and from that experience, I assume that you've drawn some of those conclusions. But would you also state, because of those experiences, that you looked upon the new country, the United States, the Republic, as having somewhat an isolationist position, that entanglement with Europe in particular would be very much a mistake?
Yes, of course, and we mustn't send our young people to study in Europe, because what happens, these are mostly men in my time, they go to Europe and they gain a passion for luxury. They, of course, fall in love with the seductive European women. They are, of course, extremely seductive and interesting, sophisticated women, but then they come back and they feel contempt for the simple farm girls of America. And so there's a problem. European culture is almost unbearably attractive, and it seduces us into thinking we should have these things here. But I think the price of them is largely too high for the United States. So I am an isolationist, and I believe that we should be content to be a kind of pastoral homespun culture and avoid some of the worst excesses of European luxury.
So you're indicating that Europe was too much directed towards the heart in that particular realm rather than the head?
Of course, and you know, when the French Revolution began and the nobles, the aristocrats came in for the first time for 200 years and into the Estates General, they quipped and punned and did verbal swordplay, but they couldn't get serious because they were essentially a frivolous people. They didn't know what was at stake. We had to teach them, we Americans, Franklin and I and others had to teach them what was at stake in the French Revolution. Mrs. Cosway is a perfect case in point. I was never so deeply in love as I was with Maria Cosway. And I even thought she could come to America and possibly we could have a relationship if she divorced her husband. But then when she actually offered to do it, I realized there's no way that a woman of that sort could ever actually be assimilated into our culture. She would be too sophisticated, too seductive, too openly sexual, too provocative in her dress and her manners. The American women would resent it, and I suppose rightly so. And she would be an exotic in Virginia when she was a typical cosmopolitan European woman of fashion in Paris. And so I think everyone who's ever been to Europe will agree with me that some things make perfect sense in European soil that unfortunately could never be brought back to the United States and maintained here.
Well, I'm torn what question to ask you, Mr. President Jefferson, when you're right here in front of us. And in our time, of course, there are different people who react differently to others. And there are a great number of people who have many, many friends. And you had many, many friends. Were those friendships friends of the heart, or were they more friends of the head? For example, some of the other Southern Virginia gentlemen who lived on plantations near yours, what kind of relationship did you have with them?
I had very good friendships. Monroe, my neighbor and close friend and protege, but particularly James Madison, my closest friend. But you know what, Mr. Madison and I, although we were closest friends, I suppose you would say best friends, we never touched each other. We never hugged. We never said, "I love you, my friend," or "I couldn't live without you," or "I can't tell you how much you mean to me," or "My goodness, have I missed you?" None of that. I mean, these sound like routine things in your time, but when I was dying in 1826, I wrote one of my last letters to Mr. Madison, and I said, "The friendship which has now subsisted between us for 5 decades has never known a single moment of displeasure." And for me, that was volcanic emotionalism. I said, "Take care of me when dead." But we were hyper polite. And so Mr. Madison, I might have said, "Mr. Madison, you have been missed." But notice I put it in the passive voice. We were highly uncomfortable with effusion. And the Enlightenment was about antagonism to irrationality and enthusiasm and mysticism and piety. So we were trying to be rational beings, utopian characters, and I suppose I was more of this than others. And I'm sure Mr. Madison would have been willing to be more effusive than I was. But this was my style, and all of my friends conformed, and no one ever dared to approach me more bluntly.
On that note, I have to bring that part of the permanent conclusion. We must ask Dr. Clay Jinkson to come out of character at this point. He has been with us over the past 6 years. He's just renowned in his field. He's a Rhodes Scholar, and he is the most preeminent scholar on this subject of Chautauqua performances, and certainly of Thomas Jefferson. And Dr. Jinkson, thank you so much. And let's take a minute to talk out of character. What does this process mean to you and to the universities and colleges and to the general public as you and others perform throughout the United States?
Well, look what we've just been doing here. We've been wrestling with one of the fundamental issues of life. How do you build a life of balance? How do you decide what place love has in your life as opposed to work and community and so on? How emotional can you be and still be a respected professional and so on? These are questions that men and women face, particularly women, because as women emerge more fully into the workplace and into power positions, they're having to decide how to groom themselves in order to remain women, to be loyal to their own gender training, and yet conform in some ways to societal expectations so that they can't be dismissed as emotional or hysterical or woman-like. I'm sure you've been through this all of your life. You know, it's not an easy thing, and I think we're living in a time now when this question really needs to be wrestled with, the head and the heart. So that's why I do historical characters, because they're a window which opens these questions. Instead of just chatting about it, which is what we would do in a coffee shop, we do it in a rather more formal way, and we filter our examination of it through the point of view of an extraordinary human being, Thomas Jefferson. And I would say this much: if Jefferson had been more integrated between his head and his heart, we wouldn't have a tenth of the achievement. In a sense, I mean, he would hate this kind of talk. But Thomas Jefferson's Herculean achievement is based probably upon the dysfunctional nature of his soul, that he was a kind of head delivery machine with a heart that was at some uneasy tether, and that fueled him. That made him the great man that he was. Today he'd be in therapy and he probably wouldn't write the Declaration of Independence. He'd be home being happy.
And he probably wouldn't be President of the United States, or would possibly not have been.
It's an interesting problem.
Yes. Which is almost out of time, but don't you also find that this format, as you tour, and certainly as we use it at North Idaho College and classes, makes the learning process so much easier?
Well, I love what you're doing here. You know, the students who participate, the professors, the staff people, they get into it, as they like to say, and that embodiment creates a whole new creative energy, and I think it's changing the way we teach all across the country, but you've been the pioneers here at North Idaho College.
Well, you've really been the pioneer. You've been our teacher, and our audience doesn't know that you also do workshops for us sometimes in the wintertime. Ladies and gentlemen, we've did the first show of 10 shows. Be with us again next week, and we'll continue to talk about journey through time. Good evening, and we'll see you next week.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running entirely college-produced program on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us again at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.